The emergency call came in at 4:55 a.m. Neighbors in Kemerovo screaming in their building. Someone was getting hurt in one of the apartments. They could hear a woman screaming through the door, describing it as a slaughterhouse. They dialed 112. No answer. Called again? Still nothing. For 3 hours, these Russian citizens called for help. 3 hours of terror. 3 hours of waiting for police who would never come. By the time officers finally arrived, it was too late. Another statistic in Russia's collapsing law and order. But here's the thing that should terrify you. This isn't happening in some war-torn region. This is happening across Russia right now. As of early 2025, Russia is bleeding police officers. 172,000 unfilled positions nationwide, a devastating 33,000 jump from the previous year. In some regions, that translates to up to 75% of jobs vacant, leaving vast areas effectively unguarded. And what's filling the void? Armed vigilante groups, ex-convicts, combat-shattered veterans who've learned that violence solves problems. We're watching a nuclear superpower disintegrate from within, and what comes next will shock you. Let's start with the numbers that should make Putin lose sleep at night. Interior Minister Vladimir Kolokotsev can no longer hide the scale of this crisis. In March 2025, he revealed the country now has 172,000 unfilled police positions, a staggering increase of 33,000 vacancies in just 1 year. Entire regions are operating with skeleton crews. Some provinces function with just 2/3 of their required officers. Think about that for a second. That's not just a shortage, that's the systematic breakdown of basic government function. But here's what's really driving this collapse. The war in Ukraine has turned into a police recruitment black hole. See, the types of people motivated to do police work are often the same people drawn to military service. And right now, Russian soldiers can earn several times what a police officer makes. A patrol officer in the provinces earns as little as 25,000 rubles per month. That's about $270. Meanwhile, combat soldiers are pulling in massive signing bonuses and war pay. But it's not just about money. There's something even more insidious happening here. The Russian government has created quotas for Interior Ministry staff to send men to the front lines. Police agencies are literally required to contribute recruits to the war effort. Some officers are being offered cash bonuses, up to 100,000 rubles, for persuading criminal detainees to enlist for Ukraine. Think about that for a moment. Police officers in St. Petersburg can double their monthly salary by sending just 2 detainees per month to war. This creates a perverse incentive where some cops focus more on funneling suspects to the military than actually fighting crime. One suspect in Voronezh alleged that police beat and electrocuted him to force him to sign a military contract. When officers were eventually arrested for this abuse, it revealed just how desperate the system has become. So thousands of officers are literally walking off the job to go fight in Ukraine. They're trading their badges for rifles because the math is simple. Why risk your life for peanuts when you can risk it for real money? Others stay in police work only to avoid conscription, since police are exempt from the draft. But even that incentive hasn't stopped the massive outflow of personnel. And those who stay behind, they're drowning. With massive vacancies, the remaining officers are working 16-hour shifts. They're covering multiple precincts. Some district officers who should be responsible for one area are now handling 4 precincts. That's about 160 people under active supervision. One officer in the Kaluga region told reporters that he's supposed to visit these people twice a month. With his impossible workload, he admits he hasn't seen some of them even once. But here's what makes this situation even more desperate. The quality of remaining officers is plummeting. As many as 40% of resigning officers now leave before retirement age. These aren't rookies washing out. These are experienced veterans with decades of knowledge walking away from their careers. In 2024, half of all officers with 10 years of experience quit their jobs. One precinct in Yekaterinburg saw nearly 100% staff turnover in just 6 years. What's left behind are either young, inexperienced recruits who have no idea what they're doing or empty desks. The system is breaking down so badly that officers are buying their own office supplies, fuel, and equipment just to do their jobs. A throwback to the chaotic 1990s that Russians thought they'd left behind forever. But the real horror story? Citizens are discovering that calling the police has become a gamble with their lives. What happens when a country's law enforcement system collapses? We're finding out in real time, and it's terrifying. Russia's Interior Ministry is now forecasting the highest spike in violent crime in 15 years. In 2024, serious and especially serious crimes reached 617,301, the highest figure in over 14 years according to ministry data. Recent statistics from the Ministry of Internal Affairs show that between January and June 2025, 333,251 serious and particularly serious crimes were documented, a 10.4% rise compared to the same period in 2024. This means that the number of serious crimes in Russia has already reached a 15-year high by mid-2025. But here's what should terrify every Russian citizen. This isn't just about statistics. It's about the complete breakdown of the rule of law. In many Russian towns, calling the police has become an exercise in futility. Emergency response times have stretched from minutes to hours, if responses come at all. And we're not talking about minor crimes here. We're talking about life or death situations where citizens are literally fighting for survival while waiting for help that may never arrive. But statistics don't capture the human cost of this breakdown. Take what happened in the Kemerovo region, when the shortage was far less severe than today. 7 emergency calls about a violent assault, no officers for over 3 hours. Neighbors broke down the door themselves to find 23-year-old Vera Pektileva murdered by her ex-boyfriend. Today, with forces decimated, such tragedies aren't exceptional, they're routine. Across Russia, emergency calls go unanswered. Rural districts operate without protection. One Siberian detective handling dozens of cases alone admits marking most as not possible to investigate. This creates a predatory environment that feeds on itself. When criminals realize there's little chance of being caught or punished, they get bolder. They start telling their friends. Those friends commit crimes they know they can get away with. They push the envelope, escalating from petty theft to violent crime, testing how far they can go before anyone stops them. But in today's Russia, that intervention increasingly never comes. Here's how bad it's gotten. In some regions, police forces are now refusing to open new criminal cases even after crimes are reported. Officers are so overwhelmed they're essentially triaging which crimes deserve attention and which ones to ignore completely. A BBC investigation found that in many areas, if you're the victim of robbery, burglary, or assault, police will essentially tell you to handle it yourself. They don't have the manpower to investigate, the resources to pursue leads, or the time to build cases. This has created entire neighborhoods where criminals operate with complete impunity. They know the odds of facing consequences are virtually zero. And in some truly dystopian developments, desperate police departments have resorted to falsifying evidence and coercing confessions just to close cases quickly. Veteran officers describing beaten suspects so they take the blame, not because they're guilty, but because closing files is the only way to manage impossible caseloads. This means innocent people are being framed for crimes they didn't commit, while the real criminals remain free to strike again. It's a complete breakdown of justice that undermines any remaining public trust in the system. And the criminals aren't just getting bolder, they're getting deadlier. Many aren't ordinary thugs at all. They're combat veterans, battle-scarred, psychologically shattered, and legally pardoned for past crimes if they fought in Ukraine. Since the war began, over 750 civilians have been killed or seriously injured by returning servicemen, former soldiers now turned predators. As of February 2025, 378 people died in veteran-related incidents. This isn't rehabilitation, it's the weaponization of society's most dangerous elements. The Russian government's response to this crisis? They've essentially given up on traditional policing and handed the streets over to vigilantes. Meet the shadow enforcers of Putin's crumbling state. Russkaya Obchina, the Russian community. Black-clad paramilitaries with warrior emblems and a mandate to operate beyond legal constraints. They're Russia's largest far-right organization. 1.2 million YouTube subscribers, 650,000 Telegram followers, 140 chapters spanning 11 time zones. Their innovation? A mobile app where citizens summon armed vigilantes instead of dialing police. Hit the SOS button and masked enforcers appear to deliver their version of justice. This isn't dystopian fiction, it's Putin's Russia in 2025. In Novosibirsk, these militants rounded up construction workers and force-marched them to police stations. In St. Petersburg, they raided an apartment where a fire broke out and killed the suspect. In remote forest, they tortured a teenager with electric shock devices while threatening rape and murder. The Russian government's response? Open collaboration. Police across multiple regions openly welcome vigilante assistance due to critical understaffing. When officers arrive at scenes involving Ruskaya Obshchina, the paramilitaries control the narrative while victims remain silent from fear. But here's what makes this collaboration even more disturbing. It's not just happening in remote areas. This is occurring in major cities in broad daylight with full knowledge of local authorities. These groups regularly accompany official raids, providing muscle during operations against migrant communities. They conduct warrantless searches, detain people without legal authority, and interrogate suspects using methods that would be illegal if employed by actual police. But when they occasionally face arrest, high-ranking officials intervene. After St. Petersburg police detained vigilantes for attacking taxi drivers, Alexander Bystrykin, head of Russia's investigative committee, opened cases against the arresting officers for exceeding authority. This sends an unmistakable message. These groups enjoy protection from the highest levels of power. What's even more chilling is how organized and sophisticated these groups have become. They operate training camps where they teach building assault tactics with firearms. They run cyber troops that scour the internet for content they deem unpatriotic or unorthodox, filing mass complaints to shut down everything from comic books to music festivals. They've even established funding networks that raise money for the Russian army in Ukraine, giving them political cover while they operate their parallel enforcement system. But Ruskaya Obshchina represents more than street patrols. They're building a parallel enforcement system that could outlast the current regime. Here's where the nightmare truly begins. For 3 years, Russia has recruited prisoners to fight in Ukraine. Murderers, rapists, violent predators promise freedom in exchange for combat service. These men are now returning home, legally pardoned, combat-trained, psychologically destroyed. Over 1,130 veterans now face new criminal charges. But the real scope is far from terrifying. Among documented cases, 166 involved outright murders that claimed 196 lives. Another 112 deaths resulted from grievous bodily harm. Most occurred in domestic settings, often alcohol-fueled, typically targeting family members or acquaintances. But these numbers only capture what's been reported and prosecuted. Independent investigations suggest the real toll could be 2 or 3 times higher. The individual cases reveal systematic horror. Sergei Kozlov, a Wagner fighter who returned home and murdered his pregnant 18-year-old partner with such brutality that documenting her 138 injuries required multiple pages. Then there's the case of Ivan Rosomakin, a convicted murderer who was recruited by Wagner, completed his combat service, and promptly killed again after returning home. When local media asked if he'd be allowed to sign another military contract, the question wasn't treated as absurd. Or consider what happened in Achinsk, where veteran Kirill Chepligin allegedly murdered both his ex-wife and her new partner in broad daylight. Security cameras captured him chasing the woman across a snowy playground before stabbing her to death while she screamed for help. These aren't isolated incidents of combat stress or PTSD episodes. These are calculated acts of violence by men who have learned that killing solves problems and that Russian society will protect them as long as they're considered heroes. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Many of these crimes are being treated leniently by Russian courts. Military service is now considered a mitigating factor in criminal sentencing. In about 2/3 of cases involving veteran defendants, judges have reduced sentences or dismissed charges entirely because the accused served their country. This represents something unprecedented. The state-sponsored militarization of criminality. Up to 35% of fighters on average suffer PTSD, roughly 150,000 men requiring psychological support that doesn't exist. Some returning fighters have been conditioned to solve problems through violence and now operate in a society where police response is functionally non-existent. But here's what Russian authorities aren't telling you. The psychological damage goes far beyond individual veterans. Experts are now documenting something called secondary PTSD, affecting the families and communities of returning fighters. Wives, children, and neighbors are developing trauma symptoms just from living around these men. Domestic violence rates in military families have skyrocketed. Psychologist Ludmila Petronovskaya has warned that families and Russian society should exercise caution around returning veterans because many will be psychologically unstable. Meanwhile, many struggle adjusting to civilian wages after earning massive combat bonuses. Some refuse jobs paying less than military service. The result? A turn toward organized crime for easy money. Criminal syndicates now recruit ex-soldiers as contract killers and enforcers, prompting rivals to militarize in response. Khaki gangs, entirely veteran-composed criminal units, clash with established organizations, intensifying violence nationwide. Meanwhile, weapons flood the black market. In just May and June 2025, authorities dismantled 157 arms trafficking rings across 51 regions, seizing grenade launchers and 140 kilograms of explosives. That's enough firepower to outfit a militia and represents only what they found. The state created this monster by weaponizing criminals. Now it can't control what it unleashed. What we're witnessing represents the fundamental unraveling of the social contract that holds civilization together. Citizens pay taxes and follow laws in exchange for basic security and order. In Russia, that agreement lies shattered. Every ruble bombing Ukrainian cities is one not spent on domestic law enforcement. Every officer recruited for foreign combat leaves civilians more vulnerable at home. Russians increasingly understand this brutal calculus, and resentment is building. In affected regions, residents stage protests demanding police protection. Former law enforcement officials warn that unsolved crimes could trigger outbursts of social negativity as people lose faith in state institutions. This threatens Putin's core legitimacy, built on ending 1990s chaos through authoritarian stability. His implicit deal was simple: surrender political freedom for economic prosperity and personal security. Now prosperity vanishes while crime explodes, yet authoritarianism intensifies. People expect civilized societies to maintain rule of law. Without it, regime support can evaporate rapidly. The 2023 Prigozhin mutiny offered a preview of internal instability's dangers. That revolt failed partly because most Russians still trusted their government and believed in military victory. But conditions have deteriorated dramatically since then. Police forces that remained loyal during Wagner's march may no longer exist in many regions. The vigilante groups Putin tolerates could easily redirect their weapons toward authorities if leadership fails to serve their interests. And here's something that should chill every world leader. Russia's regional governors are already quietly preparing for potential breakdown scenarios. Some are reportedly building relationships with local strongmen and militia leaders as insurance policies in case central authority collapses. We're seeing the emergence of what experts call security feudalism, where different armed groups control different territories based on their ability to project force rather than legal authority. In some regions, it's vigilante groups like Russkaya Obshchina. In others, it's veteran-led criminal organizations. In still others, it's a combination of corrupt police, private security firms, and paramilitary units that operate more like medieval armies than modern law enforcement. This mirrors how states collapse, not through sudden revolution, but gradual authority erosion until central control only extends to select territories while local strongmen dominate the rest. The trajectory toward total breakdown is accelerating beyond anyone's control. Consider the mathematics: 90,000 police vacancies in late 2022, 152,000 by spring 2024, 172,000 by early 2025. That's not gradual decline, that's systemic collapse. The forces driving this disintegration show no signs of abating. The Ukrainian war continues indefinitely. Officers keep leaving for higher military pay. Battle-scarred veterans return in growing numbers to a society unprepared for their reintegration. But the scale of this crisis dwarfs any historical precedent Russia has faced. After Afghanistan's withdrawal, crime spiked and veterans struggled, but the numbers remained manageable. The Ukrainian conflict involves vastly more people, hundreds of thousands trained in violence, many with serious criminal backgrounds, returning to territories where effective law enforcement no longer exists. Unlike Afghan veterans, these men include tens of thousands of former convicts with extensive criminal experience. They've endured extreme violence for extended periods and now re-enter communities where police response has become essentially theoretical. Historical parallels offer sobering warnings. Post-World War II Soviet crime rates significantly increased from 1944 to 1946, prompting Stalin to massively expand his repressive apparatus. But Stalin commanded millions of loyal security personnel. Putin watches his forces drain away to foreign battlefields while armed groups and criminal syndicates fill the vacuum. Some experts suggest Putin might respond by assigning returning veterans new foreign missions, launching additional acts of aggression to prevent domestic destabilization. In other words, the internal security breakdown could drive Russia toward even greater international aggression. But there's another possibility that's genuinely terrifying: gradual state fragmentation. If current trends persist, we might witness regional strongmen emerging, armed militias controlling territories, and central authority existing only in name outside major urban centers. Western intelligence agencies are already documenting how the Kremlin leverages criminal networks for sabotage and cyber attacks in Europe. Battle-hardened ex-convicts are becoming key assets in hybrid warfare against NATO countries. If Russia fragments internally while maintaining these criminal intelligence networks abroad, we could see something unprecedented: a nuclear-armed failed state that projects instability globally through organized crime and terrorism. Imagine regions of Russia controlled by veteran warlords who finance themselves through drug trafficking, arms dealing, and contract killing, while still having access to Soviet-era weapons stockpiles and potentially even tactical nuclear materials. This isn't science fiction. Intelligence analysts are already mapping scenarios where Russian organized crime groups, empowered by state collapse, become transnational security threats that dwarf anything we've seen from traditional terrorist organizations. But there's another possibility that's genuinely terrifying: gradual state fragmentation. If current trends persist, we might witness regional strongmen emerging, armed militias controlling territories, and central authority existing only in name outside major urban centers. Consider the implications for global security: a nuclear-armed nation with thousands of tactical weapons scattered across territories experiencing localized governmental breakdown. If Russia fails to implement massive rehabilitation and weapons control programs, and everything suggests they won't, they could face an internal security crisis worse than anything that followed Chechnya or Afghanistan. The country is conducting a vast, uncontrolled experiment in what happens when you weaponize criminals, destroy your police force, and let vigilantes run wild. And we're all about to find out how that experiment ends. The situation has become genuinely heartbreaking to witness: a nuclear superpower voluntarily dismantling its own civilization. Russia has engineered a perfect storm: depleted law enforcement, traumatized veterans, empowered vigilante groups, weaponized criminals, and flooding black markets. Each element amplifies the others in an accelerating spiral beyond institutional control. Today's vigilante solutions could become tomorrow's warlord territories. Current veteran heroes might evolve into organized crime kingpins. The weapons trafficking networks won't disappear when hostilities end. Most dangerously, an entire generation is growing up with toxic beliefs: violence solves problems, laws don't apply equally, power, not justice, defines who wins. A generation raised to believe that might trump right, the same generation that might ignore a woman screaming through a door at 4:55 a.m. because they've learned that nobody's coming to help anyway. This is how civilizations unravel, not through foreign conquest, but internal decay reaching critical mass. Russia may have already crossed that threshold. The data speaks definitively. The trends accelerate relentlessly, and the government prioritizes external warfare over internal stability. What unfolds next will determine whether Russia remains a functioning state or transforms into something entirely different, a nuclear-armed collection of territories governed by whoever commands the most firepower. For the sake of both Russian citizens and global security, one hopes Moscow finally hears these alarm bells. But if current patterns persist, we might witness the real-time disintegration of one of history's major powers. And that breakdown won't remain confined with Russian borders. Can Russia pull back from the brink, or is this descent irreversible? Drop your thoughts in the comments and hit subscribe for breakdowns that go beyond the headlines. Because what happens in Russia won't stay there, and the world needs to be ready.